Okay. Well, it is now 10:30 and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. This, I will remind you, is a interactive program. It acts when you act. So if you have comments and questions, uh, that's your ticket in. So we'll be looking for you to add your comments. It's not just about me doing my talking head thing. It's about the interaction between us and between our guests today, which is very exciting. And also between you. If you have things that you you can respond to, if someone else has a question or someone else has an experience and it resonates with an experience that you had, then that's a thing. We want to hear about that. We want to share that. I think we all gain something from sharing our mutual experiences. We're going to be talking today about the Dust Bowl. Now, that's a very important part of not only South Dakota history, but the country's history. Lots of things happened as a result of the Dust Bowl, and lots of things happened that caused the Dust Bowl. Lots of interesting spin-offs that change kind of the pathway, trajectory, we say sometimes, of U.S. history. Now, we're not going to have enough time to get into all of that because it's a big story, and that story is still being told. It's still being acted on today. But one of the things we're going to try to do a little bit different today is we're going to prompt you with some questions, because we would like to see more interaction and we want to see more of your ideas in this mix of talking about the various subjects. So today we're going to try something a little bit different. I think you'll see on your screen now there's 3 questions. And those 3 questions is, what do you know about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era? And a lot of it we want to focus on like your personal experiences. It's not a history quiz, but it's really like, well, what happened? What do you know? What did you hear growing up as a kid? And some of you may have even, there might be people who are old that actually can remember it. But the idea is like, how does it affect you personally? Like, how did the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era affect you? And even if you didn't live in that time, I think you can see, like, from your parents, like how did it change, like how they reacted? What impression or what impact do you think that the Dust Bowl had on them? And then a lot of what happens, what we're going to talk about today, has to do with farm practices, and that's, when you're in the bread basket of America, when you're plains after plains growing wheat and corn and stuff, that's a thing. Farming is important to us socially, culturally, economically, et cetera. So what kind of changes in farming practices do you see as a result of this Dust Bowl era? So be thinking about that and have that in the back of your mind, because we're going to be covering a lot of interesting facets of this whole Dust Bowl thing. So keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back and try to stimulate some conversation about it, because I think we learn better when we're actually engaged in the conversation as opposed to just listening to people. And it's sort of like the preacher that preaches for 20 to 30 minutes, and then after the sermon, nobody remembers what he said. But if they had a discussion about it, then you probably will remember more than just a talking head up at the pulpit. So I'm hoping that will help us to find a better connection. That said, our guest today is Gwen McCausland, and Gwen is she's the boss lady over at the agriculture, the South Dakota Agricultural Museum. She's the director. That's the formal title. I call her the boss lady, but that's her formal title is the director at the South Dakota Agricultural Heritage Museum, and that's over at SDSU, South Dakota State University. And right now, they have an exhibit called Drowning in Dirt, Joseph Hutton and the Dust Bowl. So welcome, Gwen. And we're going to start off by asking you to kind of give us your dossier, your personal dossier. What would it look like if you were to pull your own dossier out? What would the thumbnails look like?
So thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate having the time to share about our exhibit. My personal background is I grew up on a sheep farm in North Dakota, and I'm a daughter of a veterinarian, and we were very much part of that practice. I then also have a bachelor's degree in anthropology from North Dakota State University, and I have a master's degree in ethnology from Cardiff University in Cardiff, Wales. So I've been the director, I'll be the director of the museum for 10 years this May, which I'm really excited.
So you started that job when you were 10 years old?
Oh yeah, you're so sweet. So yes, it was 10 years ago, and I've worked in museums in New Mexico, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and I've also was an intern at the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada, and then part of the Museum of Welsh Life in Wales. So I have a very wide mix. I've worked in collections, exhibits, and in education.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a real authority on this subject today because you're a researcher and an exhibitor. So I understand that the focus of it really has a lot to do with Joseph Hutton. Tell us about Joseph Hutton. Who was he, and tell us about his ideas. What made him special?
So Joseph Hutton was one of the first soil scientists in South Dakota. He was born in Indiana and grew up on a farm there, and was actually a one-room school teacher in Indiana before he went on and got his bachelor's and eventually his master's degree in both botany and in geology. So at this time, this was in the early 19-teens, it was a very new concept. Soil science as a science was not necessarily a thing, and even the term ecology was developed at the time that he was going through graduate school. He then became one of the first soil scientists at South Dakota State University, which at that time was the College of Agriculture. And from 1911 to 1939, he was a professor of agronomy. What makes him really unique is that when he was at the University of Illinois, he met his mentor was Cyril Hoskins, and he really he created this new concept called permanent agriculture. At that time, it was thought that dirt is dirt, and you can plant any seed anywhere and it should grow. Where he really believed that soil had a finite level of nutrients, not all the soil was the same, and that you had to adjust your farming practices so that you had sustainable agriculture. This revolutionized the thinking, and it really kind of pushed back at the standards of that day. For Hutton, it was like his calling to God, as he called it. And he really truly believed that soil was the source of all life. And he and his colleague, Dr. Hume was actually here at SDSU first, and then solicited Hutton to come and do the first soil survey of South Dakota. But the interesting thing about Hutton is that I call him the Renaissance man. He was an avid photographer, like the Ansel Adams of soil science. He also loved to write poetry, and he wrote poetry about soil. He had his own radio program on campus that promoted soil conservation, and he was a constant he had lots of requests to do speeches and talks. He was also a feminist. He really believed women should have equal rights. They should have the right to vote, and they should have equal rights to education. So he was a very unique character in this time. The interesting thing is he saw the breaking up of natural prairie land, or what they called virgin land. And he saw how the current practices of that day slowly dwindled the nutrients of the soil. He also, as doing the soil survey, he saw that not all the soil was the same in South Dakota. And as we know today, West River and East River, very different in soil composition and what you can grow there. But at the time, a lot of the settlers moved out west, and they thought it was going to be the new Iowa. And so they brought out people to settle the area and to farm as if it was Iowa, which we all know is not the same environment, not the same soil. So what most people don't realize is that in South Dakota, the drought actually started in the 1920s. And continued and through until 1939. So the farmers were already struggling, trying to have high yields and sustainability at that time. By the time the crash happened, it was a double whammy when it comes to not only a drought, but also an economic drop. So it ended up being a time in which of course, government had lots of programs. And one of them was developing a soil conservation service. And that was then developed into NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Hutton was one of the first founding members, and he was then, of course, funded to go across the state and help with soil conservation and help try and preserve the farm so that there would be an economic draw for the farmers. One thing that was at that time, the idea of a farmer was the best farmers had not a stick of vegetation after they would harvest, and they'd plow it all under. They also believed at that time that if you plowed, it'd bring rain. And as we know that it, without having vegetation keeping the soil in place, erosion was rampant. So it was very important in his eyes to help understand what the soil was so that he could help the farmers change in which they farm so that it would be sustainable. He did help several people across the state. One in particular is a good story that I like to tell, is how one farmer near Huron, he was not cooperating with Hutton's advice. His neighbors were. So what Hutton was promoting was crop rotation, windbreaks, planting your crops on what they call listing, so perpendicular to the wind, and also leaving vegetation on the fields, and then integrating livestock to help fertilize it. He also believed in adjusting what you don't plow up all the land, you leave some marginal land for pasture land as well. Well, the one farmer, which I won't name names because I don't know if the family's still around the Huron area, he would not follow those instructions where his neighbors were. And so his topsoil literally buried and choked out the crops of his three neighbors. It had happened in consecutive years that it basically devastated them, and they had to abandon their land. So the idea of that he could do whatever he wanted to his own land and no one could be impacted by that was folly, because he ended up then those families had to abandon their farm, to the point where Hutton goes back to photograph the problems that happened with this, and he noticed that all of the items that they had were still in the house. They literally filled a truck with what they could and left.
So it impacted them to the point that they became kind of the story of the grapes of wrath, one of the classic stories. And by the way, we have a list of books for those of you who would like to investigate this story more. There's a list of books, and there are more, but we just gave you a few on the Dust Bowl and the social and economic impact that it had on us. You talked a little bit about your receptivity to his ideas vis-a-vis this one fellow, but generally, what was the reaction to Hutton's ideas in
Well,
his time?
what was great about Hutton, because he was a farmer, plus he was a school teacher, he had this rapport with the farmers. He knew how to communicate to them, so he wasn't seen as this scientist that's coming out with these newfangled ideas and he didn't know what he's talking about. But there was several farmers that did, and he was able to help those be able to at least keep a crop going and hopefully harvest. The biggest challenge too, environmentally, of course, there was the drought. There was also locust swarms. So a lot of them, there was a saying, they ate everything but the mortgage. And what you could harvest then maybe was eaten by locusts. So he had a battle, but there were certain farms, especially in Beetle County, that he used as an example at the state fair, where he showed how they had such large dunes that the horses were able to climb over the fences to where they were actually able to harvest a crop. He also had worked with the area to by identifying which was better pasture land versus farmland. Also then helped later on when they did the land buyout in 1937, or the Land Reclamation Act is what they were called. And that's where the government had funding where they relocated farmers. They bought out their land and relocated them into more prosperous land that was more conducive to cultivation. And some of those acres were then sold to other ranchers, especially out in West. And then some of them were turned into national grasslands, like the Great River grasslands in Perkins County.
So a lot of when we look on a map of South Dakota and we see these grasslands, designated grasslands, a lot of those grasslands are a result of the Dust Bowl and the government buying out those farms and then converting them into grasslands, which theoretically will reinvigorate the soil over time.
Well, and most people don't realize that ranchers can rent out the land and use them as pasture. So
Sure.
it's not that it's not touched, that you can, as a rancher or a farmer, even my own family personally, we use federal lands to graze our sheep during the summer. So it is still available for the public to utilize, as so it does contribute back to the economy and the agricultural economy. The other thing is they also bought out livestock. And so a lot of the livestock just didn't have the grain, and they didn't have the pastures. So they bought out and also to trying to reduce the inventory, so that because at that point the price of livestock dropped like 70%. So they ended up having to buy them out for $20 a head for cattle and $8 a calf, and that was at an 80% loss. So it was very difficult at that time, but that was either having them starve or at least getting some income from that. So it was very difficult, especially since a third of the population in South Dakota left from 1930 to 1940. And so a lot of communities once had a vibrant downtown disappeared.
Right, right. Well, that's one of the things I often marvel about is, when we talk about uh, farm programs, we often talk about them like they are disconnected from our daily lives, even if we aren't farmers, and because people think about it in terms of dollars and cents for cattle and for produce, but they forget that the whole point of the produce is like we have to eat, even if we're not farmers, we have to eat. And if those farmers sink, if those farmers take a dive, we all take a dive. Just like the kind of like the depression. It's like if there's nothing to eat, doesn't matter if you have money. If there's nothing to buy, if there's no food to buy, even if you could buy a TV, if you can't eat it, it's not a thing. So I think that that's why I think that these kind of connections always come back to us and seeing our connection with the farmers. Now, if I have an issue with the farm programs, is that it benefits too few farmers and only some farmers, and the rest of them are made to feel ashamed that that they get help. But anyway, that's a whole other program. Now, today's program, we're at the point now where we ask our esteemed co-audience here. First question: what do you know about the Great Depression, or if you have any other comments about what Ms. Causland has been speaking about, share your thoughts with us. Miss Betty?
Good morning, everyone. I'm probably the oldest person in South Dakota this morning, but I am still affected by the Depression, by the drought, because my parents were married about the time that started, and they were in Roberts County, and that's where they lived for many years before eventually they moved to Aberdeen, where I was born and raised. So they never forgot, and they didn't get real specific. It was kind of like I heard the same horrible things over and over, and they weren't horrible, but obviously they were very affected. Mom always talked about how when you'd set the table, you had to set your plates upside down because they'd be full of sand by the time you sat down to eat if you didn't. And the way we always told my dad as we were teenagers that he must be a miser because he was so thrifty. And those practices carried through. I have 4 living siblings, and we are much the same as each other in the way that we're thrifty, very conservative in our material goods for the most part. So it still affects all of us who came from that period via our parents, grandparents, and continue to go that way. So this is fascinating. Thank you for doing this today.
Yeah, you make a very good point there, Betty, and lots of us can easily forget because it's one of the things that's hard to keep top of mind, that the experiences of our parents and sometimes even our grandparents translates to our attitudes, which we often think is like about free will and we can decide to choose this or that. But a lot of times you don't know what the choices are because you grow up in the soup where there's no carrots, so you can't like just put carrots in there. You don't even know that there's such a thing as carrots, So when we have ideas, a lot of them have to do with how we grew up, what were our options, and why did they when we think about culture, we think about culture as this thing that somebody writes down in a book or somebody tells you a story, but we kind of forget that the most conservative idea at one time was radical because nobody had ever heard of that before. And so people weren't doing it, so your experience is, I think, very much mirrors my experience anyway, as far as like picking up things. Vicky, you look like you're chomping at the bit. You have something to add.
Well, Daddy, I have to tell you, my father left the farm near Seneca and went to Huron, and I was looking at the dates, and he went to Huron for work, met my mom there, had one child, then when he had me, which had been in 1946, he went back to the homestead and decided to farm. So I really never heard too much about the Depression. What I did hear was there was this terrible wind and no rain. Never did I hear till very late in life that it was due to the way the farmers were farming the land. But I do find it when I first started, I thought it never affected me. Well, it did, because at that time in 46, it was okay for my father to buy the land from his father and start farming again. And so I was part of clearing the pasture to put crops in later on. So for the first time in my life, I put that together. I had no idea that going back to the Seneca area had to do with the land. And I'm assuming by 46, the land was restored somewhat, right?
Yeah, so the rain started coming back to normal levels in 1940. And by 46, we're actually opening an exhibit on World War II in April. But the prices, of course, went up, and it was much more prosperous in higher yields and better equipment. So the one thing about in the 1930s, it wasn't just what the farmers did. Of course, the drought happened, but the dust storms, as discussed earlier, that of course was enhanced with all the tillage and getting the dust in the air. And the one thing that most people talk about is that, oh, that dust came from Kansas. No, it did not. It came from the topsoil of South Dakota. And whether or not the soil, it does take a long time for the soil to regain nutrients. But I'm sure the practices, like having it not being tilled for a number of years, definitely made a greater impact than if it was cultivated continuously. As part of this particular exhibit, we partnered with the soil scientists here at SDSU, and they took Joseph Hutton's notes and have retested the soil samples to see what 100 years of cultivation, how it has changed South Dakota soil. So that will be published this spring as well, and it will be part of a soil exhibit that will be opening next fall. So I'm really excited to share that information.
Anyone
I
else?
did have,
Mildred? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Vicky.
I did have one question.
Mhm.
Down in the Huron area where there were more trees, and if I remember correctly, it was a little more lush. Did the trees have anything to do with stopping the blowing soil? I know around Seneca, it's so flat, nothing would stop it. But there are areas of South Dakota that it's a little more lush. Did the dirt overtake those areas also with lots of trees and?
So the if the trees are in a nice straight row, that's a windbreak. Those are shelter belts, and those were planted during the 1930s. The Huron area has very sandy soil, and so that's why they were really more susceptible to erosion. So if you have like along the rivers where there's a lot more natural trees, I mean, South Dakota was a prairie, so the trees really grew up the cottonwoods along rivers or lakes. So the stuff that if you see out in the fields that are nice along the edges, that was actually planted. And that stops the erosion.
Mhm. One more comment. I have so many comments about the soil. The practices of Hutton, I'm very surprised that you said that he had crop rotation, integrated crops, and included animals on the farm. I thought with the recent stuff that was just recent. That's what you hear in sustainable and now. I thought that was new. I can't believe that they started it way back then, and it really isn't implemented as much as it should be to this day.
Yeah, that's number one comment. They're like, this was known 100 years ago. Why isn't it every single practice? So it gets a little bit more complicated because it's kind of multifaceted, where one, it was because it was a new idea in the 30s and 40s, it was not necessarily adopted by everybody. But once you hit into World War II and beyond, like the second half of the 20th century, you had machinery that could cultivate marginal land. You also then got an introduction of herbicides and fertilizers that were synthetic. So the idea of diversifying your farm went away and went to monoculture. So people just grew corn and soybeans. They didn't have cattle anymore. They didn't have sheep to help graze. So there was a major shift within agriculture. And why is it not known today? Well, there are some farmers in South Dakota that have been doing no-till farming since the 1970s. It's a lot of it is, well, my neighbor doesn't do it, so I'm not going to do it. And so there is a change. There's a lot more. If you ever go to a Soil Health Coalition conference, I was when I first came here, it was a small group. Now it's an entire ballroom in a hotel that is filled with young and middle-aged as well as baby boomers that are still farming that are integrating this practice. So yes, it gets frustrating when people who do practice and are trying to still sway people that, no, you don't have to farm like your granddad did, and you might get that short-term success, but not that long-term investment. And that's why sustainable agriculture is very important. And the more we get out in that that mantra, hopefully it will continue to grow and more farmers will take heed. But the farmers are not the bad people. I want to just tell that this is just a different, it just like with everything, people have a long tradition and it takes a long time to sway what was over a millennia of practicing. So farming has been around for thousands of years and it takes time. But yes, in South Dakota, it's been known for over 100 years.
Right. I think it's important to note that whose dog? Okay. I think it's important to note that when we make these kind of changes, especially when you're, like you're a farmer and you're focused on farming, as things get more complicated, you can handle fewer and fewer crops because there's so much to know about each plant and especially when you're doing monoculture, that opens up a whole new thing of different diseases that don't come when you have like lots of different crops. But when you have a monoculture, one thing will just wipe out, just go through and wipe out all of that crop. Bananas is not our thing, but it's classic with bananas that we have a whole different kind of bananas now because they're monoculture. So that corn and beans thing, it has its downside, but the reason, a lot of people like, hey, there's a lot to know. You got to watch the prices of it, the new kind of farm equipment, new kind of herbicides, pesticides, no-sides, all of that stuff, so it's, like if you think about the from the farmer's point of view, no matter how smart you are, you only have a limited amount of headspace. So you can run out of, like headspace to think of a whole new way to do something. And it's risky because, okay, that guy's saying he knows it, but, maybe you don't know it.
Well, also, the idea of farming back in the day, a lot of farmers have degrees in agronomy and they come here at SDSU, they know the science background, but there is a gamble and it is a very much a risky business, whether a hailstorm could come and wipe you out. It could be, no rain. It could be another drought like we have in the last few years we've had. The one thing too is that as things change and evolve, there's more and more people who are looking at different ways in which to not necessarily even just change what they grow, but how they grow it. So the idea of, it still takes, let's say you take a traditional or conventional form of farming and then you go to no-till or even organic farming. It will take several years for you to see the same yield growth as previously because you're not necessarily using all of the herbicides and pesticides that you've used before. And that's an organic. Now, when it comes to no-till, also it's a different equipment when it comes to how you plant because you don't need to plow it up. So there are some investment, but what most no-till farmers see is that growth and yield over it's a long-term investment. I met a farmer, she was from the Yankton area, and when we had horrible rains, this was pre-pandemic. That's my marker for time, is pre-pandemic. She said that she was able to get into the farm or into the fields because with the root system making that matrix within the soil, her equipment didn't sink. So there wasn't soil compression as much as if other people couldn't get into the field because it was too wet and didn't able to sustain the weight. And so it also is that whole how to understand, like I met this young gentleman at the state fair And he says if he sees a bare spot on his soil, he does testing right away because he does no-till, and it's basically like a blanket of corn stalks. And he wants to know, why is it not growing here? And so he wants to make sure there's a percentage of organisms and nutrients, and you can have a really healthy ecosystem will create better yield.
Great. Mildred, we're finally going to get to you. I didn't forget you. Are
Thank
you
you.
still there?
Yes, I am. My father was a grain elevator owner, and he was able to buy the grain of the farmers, and then we had large, 4 or 5 large elevators that he was able to store it in. So he actually did quite well in the sense that he could keep it until the price was such, and then he played the stock market. And so in that sense, there were some people that didn't hurt as much, although my parents did move to California, but didn't make it a year. They thought my dad, I guess, thought it was better out there. And you mentioned that, a certain proportion of the population moved out of state. Well, they were one, but they did come back, and my father kept up the grain elevators and eventually sold them, of course. But he was able to make something out of a really bad situation.
Mhm. Thank you for adding that, Mildred. Anybody else have something else that they of their experiences or questions or whatever before we go to the next phase?
Yes, I was,
Let-
this is Lanico, and I was just gonna say that aside from the fact that we've had farmers using the land for diversified, we went from the heirloom era to the hybrid era to the Terminator seed era. And these licensing agreements that grow one crop, and the farmer has to have a written agreement to be able to do that. We know now those crops are GMO crops and genetically modified organisms. So when we look at the land and how it is taking care of us and feeding us and giving us the nutrients that we need to live, we have to be really careful to pay attention to the Johnny come lately coming down the road that's going to give us instant wealth for these large acres that are stripping topsoil off. That is part of the way in which wildlife sustains itself from generation to generation. So we could talk about the Dust Bowl days, and we can also link into that kind of reasoning about how that Dust Bowl came about, and recognize that these very same conditions are all over the world. They're not just here in South Dakota. And we have, there are people who are paying close attention to stewardship of the land. And we have government that is kind of thwarting their efforts as a result of the lobbyists that have these chemicals that are part of their get rich quick kind of tools, tools for the farmer. So I would like to comment that these chemical companies are not just altering the seed, but they're also altering the land itself. So we can have overgrazing and then not touch the land, not have the animals on the land, and have a recovery. We can have chemicals dumped on the land, and it filtrates through the soil into the water streams, and it goes completely into a big cycle, so that now we have plastics and other kind of debris that are flowing along on the airwaves that we know as the jet stream. And so we need to look at the land as only one part of sustainable future. the other part of it is the human interventions. And the human interventions are kind of skirted around, rather tiptoeing around the issues. So I just kind of thought I'd throw that out there because I know that a lot of people went to California, Stockton. My brother even went to live in Stockton for a while because the joke was that all the South Dakota farmers that couldn't make it took the soil to Stockton, and that's why where they live now. But that's kind of a dirt joke. But I thought
Well,
point those features out to you.
thank you so much for that contribution, Lamiko. Sharon, you had something you want to add? You turn on your mic, though.
Thank you,
There you
Lenny.
go.
That was really wonderful what you just said, and I hope that we can comment on it. I hope that Ms. McCausland will comment on that too. But just as an example of what Leniko was saying, I can't think. I'm not sure if his last name is Borgland or Borgman. He was from Minnesota, and he was a big guy in this sort of thing. Okay. And he went to India to further so that Indian farmers could have more food, grow more food for the population. And this Borgland, used pesticides. And after a few years, he had totally destroyed the land because the land was not geared for a bunch of pesticides. And now those farmers in that particular district have to continue using pesticides because their soil is so awful without it.
I think with
Yes,
stewardship
you know,
of land anywhere, one thing I learned doing this research was about the locust swarms. I asked Dr. Berg he's been studying locust swarms for decades. And I asked him, why don't we have locust swarms today? And he said, because locusts swarm due to loss of habitat, loss of food, and impact of natural like drought or something. So two of the elements was actually spurred by humans. And what happens is when they're under stress, the grasshopper actually, their body elongates, their legs elongate, they get wings, and then they fly trying to find more food. He says that it still happens in other countries, especially on the continent of Africa, where there is more, less, they have more drought and less sustainable agriculture, because a lot of times the Western practices will go to areas where it's not necessarily adapted to that particular environment. And so that, of course, has cycled since our 1930s. And I think more and more people are aware of it, that we can't just use and abuse the land, that it is finite. And that was the one thing that Hutton was really trying to promote, and Hume as well as Hoskins, is that you can't just take all of the nutrients out of the land. I do want to pivot a little bit about people's memories. How many ever remember or hearing about using flour sacks for clothes, or using it for, yep. So in the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s, a lot of the flour companies were noticing that women were using their cloth for diapers or for aprons. And so what they did is they started printing decorations on it, and floral prints and other decorative fabrics, and selling that. And so it very much became a staple within the 1930s, and it continued on to the 1950s, where homemakers groups and 4-H clubs were teaching how to use old fruit crates and using the flour sacks to make drapes and cushions for this furniture, and making little dresses as well as skirts and aprons for themselves. And it became very much a staple of this area as well as beyond the United States throughout the country. And it's something that I wish they still did today, because I would love to get some of their really nice fabric. It's really beautiful. It's a great way to recycle. They also even use the string that came with the flour sacks for doilies or for tying up packages. And it really became an area of waste not, want not, whether you recycled like one recipe I found in the Dakota Farmer, which was an old newspaper that was printed on how to use duck fat for butter and how you render it. They also, of course, you slaughtered your own pigs or cattle, and you definitely did not waste anything. In my personal family, my grandparents were much older when they had my parents, so they lived through the Depression, and they did not throw anything away. And my parents are the same way, where you could use it. It's still good. So I think that definitely follows through even into today's society, where you kept furniture. I knew of a woman that a lot of people canned back then, and it continued through the Depression. A lot of families and farms did not have electricity, so the best way to preserve your food was through canning or drying. And so it became a whole family affair to make sure that you had plenty of food. And sometimes families, what they put up in their cellar was what they had for the winter. And so most people don't realize how much that really impacted. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily like on the farms that they didn't have food, they just didn't have money. So you really saved your money for coffee, for sugar. Some families ground their own wheat. Otherwise you had to get flour. And of course you had usually a dairy cow, and you'd feed out a pig at least to have the meat and lard and having the milk and cream. And then a lot of farms were saved by women's pin money, they called it, which was selling of the eggs and selling of the cream. That's what paid the mortgage when times were tough. So when a crop failed, they at least tried to have that as a source of income. So it wasn't just the field that was the income for the family. It was everybody, all the income they could, whether it was selling fruits and vegetables, selling the egg or cream money. And the family farm in the 1930s and the early half of the 20th century, it wasn't the men in the field and women in the household. It was like a Venn diagram where women and men in the farm was this giant circle, and they each interacted depending on what tasks needed to be done at that point in the time of the harvest. So the family farm was truly a family enterprise where everybody gave their part to make it successful.
Yeah. I think those are really important focal points about this conversation, is how much that it was a group effort, not only in the families, but also in communities, where the whole like sociology was kind of based on like everybody helping everybody else, because if you didn't, you all went down the tubes, because everybody has an uptime and a downtime. And before I forget it, I think, that those flour sacks, I could see that coming back, because that's a real, you cut 3 holes in the flour sack and you got a dress. You got the head and 2 arms, and you're all done. It's like, instead of going through all of this, like all the darts and hems and all of that, it's all done with that one flour sack. I could see that coming back as a fashion, even for men, I could see that happening.
Well, often what would happen is that women would give a swatch of the fabric. So when their husbands went to the store, they'd want to make sure they picked out the sack that still had that print. And so they could continue making either clothes for themselves or having enough yardage. So it was very much part of that, part of the waste not, want not type of mentality.
Well, I'm hoping I can finish this because I just got a sign that says, "Oh, your battery's low," and I'm in my car, so I can't I can't plug it up.
Oh.
Because I'm at the prison, and we can't take computers in the prison. But we'll go until it turns off, which who knows when that'll be.
I was just,
Okay, Sharon.
oh, sorry.
No, Lanico is on.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to point out something that might be useful to anybody who's still teaching or mentoring or tutoring any students. In 1986, my students did an oral history project wherein they interviewed their grandparents and great-grandparents about these various years. And much of what was shared today regarding the use of flour sacks and all, those became those short stories that the students put together in a book. And back in those days, we had a mimeograph machine. So we assembled these books and gave them to the families who contributed all that information. But that one of the consistencies that were throughout most of the stories, especially for the women, were how you reused your clothes to make quilts. And the South Dakota Quilting History or Quilters Guild did a wonderful story on how these pieces of garments, as well as the flour sacks and all, became materials for these quilting circles. When I moved to this little town where I live, there were 3 active quilting circles. And as time went on, of course, members passed away or moved away. But we have none anymore because the town is so small now. We don't have any of those individuals doing that. But the quilting activities were very interesting because they told stories about how they put pockets in these quilts to hide away what little money they had, so that the father could be laying underneath this quilt keeping warm, and the mother knew that there was emergency money in the blanket covering them or the quilt covering them. So there were lots of interesting stories that came out of that project.
Mhm.
Wow, that is a wonderful story, Nico, and I think it really points to how these kind of situations also push people toward innovation, to do little things. And unfortunately, a lot of those little tricks, they get lost. That's why it's important for kids to talk to their grandparents and grandparents to talk to kids, so that these things become part of like things that we know, even if we can't remember where we got them from. Sharon, you were going to say something.
Well, I think it's kind of like a duh sort of thing, but I'm thinking of the prairie and how the land has shaped the people who live on it. Whether those people are Lakota or Norwegian or whatever, they have to be self-sustaining. Not today. I mean, there are cars and highways and all that, but before all of those conveniences and technology, the land really determined how you were going to live.
I
It
think the
definitely-
land still determines how we're going to live.
Does
Go
it?
ahead, Gwen.
Oh,
yes.
it also, yeah, like it definitely determines what you can grow, how much water you can consume. There's a lot of places out west where it's still very dry, and like compared to the east side where there's more rainfall. So it really kind of determines even how we go our day to day. The one thing that I found interesting was that the way, because when like I like the comment of being sustainable, but the one thing that people don't realize is that it is very much a fabric. Like there's an interconnection, that the idea that the farmers came out and they broke up the land and they lived on their own and they didn't need any other resource within the community. It just is like that myth. And you needed the grain elevators. You needed the way in which to ship out. You needed to sell things to make money. You could grow food, but you might not have a crop that, like say your potatoes had a blight, but you still had corn that you could sell, or you had cattle you could sell. So regardless, and through the Depression, it was interesting there was a lot of families that had to take government assistance in these programs to be sustainable. And so that's idea of self-sufficiency, just, use your bootstraps and you can persevere. That was not always the case, especially a majority of the farmers had to take some form of assistance just to get by. Otherwise you left the state. So, the idea we have that there was a lot of hardships back then. And I think a lot of what I always say, I'm a product of the prairie. You understand about the weather, you understand that it can ebb and flow, and that you have to be just conscious, aware that we are not just an entity by ourselves, that we very much live within the environment and the weather and the land that we live on. So yes, I 100% agree with you that it really determines who we are and what we do, regardless of what people think. The land will always win, and the weather will always tell you.
It's very interesting because one of the stories you talked about at the top of the hour is how this one guy thought, well, I'm just doing my thing. You guys do what you want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. But in the end, his neighbors had to suffer because of him. And I think, like, even if you're on a farm and even things around you, as far as you can see, is okay, the whole world is now and has been for a long time interconnected. Even the things like the jet stream, diseases that get picked up by that jet stream go, and the organisms last way, almost into space, very cold, and then that comes down, and now you got a fowl, all of the fowl are sick, chicken diseases and stuff like that. So we're all interconnected, whether we like it or not.
Well, and I would say one thing that happened during the Depression is, okay, so a third of the population left. What's the big deal? Well, then the schools didn't have a tax base in which to keep open. Then you didn't have a main downtown because the implement dealers and the seed dealers, they all had to close. Then you didn't have any taxes for roads or any improvements. So there was then literally towns just disappeared, and it was this domino effect that it wasn't just one person, it was an entire community. And that's why I think people forget how interconnected we are and how important what we contribute to the community affects our neighbors and affects the prosperity of everyone. Because if one rises, we all rise.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm.
I had one thing
ahead,
to
Vicki.
say. It's my opinion that if you have a progressive mind and you're from a small town, I think that the small towns have a uniqueness about them, that everything has been the same since their grandfather and they're going to keep it the same. And then you have the child that has these new ideas and the parent and grandparent won't let them implement it. So if they're progressive, they're going to go into the bigger cities and where progression is admired. And that's why the smaller towns, just the base of the people in small towns, they don't want anything to change. They want everything to remain the same, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why we're losing that progressive mind that goes to the bigger city.
Well, we're almost out of time. And thank you for that, Vicki. Very important contribution to this conversation. We're almost out of time. In the 1 minute we have left, tell us about the exhibit so people can come and experience that and maybe carry on this conversation.
Yes, our exhibit is on display up until this fall. In August, we'll be closing it. But luckily, it is a traveling exhibit. So once it closes here, it'll be available to rent. And you can get more information this fall on our website at agmuseum.com.
Yeah, and imagine that's already in our chat, or will be momentarily. I will remind you that in the chat, you can click those 3 little dots and then save it to your desktop. And then if you didn't have time to type all of that stuff in, you'll have it complete with links and everything. So I want to encourage you to do that. Any last minute things we can leave people with?
I would say the more people are aware, and if you can rent this particular exhibit in your community, whether it's your library, community center, I'm hoping that we can promote this information and have everyone become a steward of the land.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for showing up. We will be here next week, same time, same station, with a brand new show. Thank you and goodbye.